Welcome, students, to the first kind of formal lecture where we begin to learn about the skeleton, particularly the human skeleton. And this is the job of the forensic anthropologist, to be the foremost expert in human skeletal remains and tissues. So, at the onset, every forensic anthropologist should have a very good understanding of human skeletal anatomy, biology, and physiology. What I have done is divided up the next few weeks into both the skull and teeth as well as the postcrania. And so this week we'll learn about skulls and teeth, but first we need to understand the directionals of the body. So we'll work on the directionals of the body in this particular segment, and then the organization of the skull, and then to things like categories of teeth, as well as the muscles of mastication and chewing. First, we must understand how the skeleton of a human, that is Homo sapiens, is divided into. And we can preliminarily divide it into two pieces. So, of course, this week we're learning about the skull. And then thereafter we'll learn about the postcranial skeleton. That is all of the bones that are beyond or post after the skull. If we're looking at from say like top to bottom, top being the skull. The skull is a very busy place. Matter of fact, it includes the cranium and the mandible, and it makes up 28 bones as an adult. Some of them are singular and others are paired. It also contains 20 milk baby or deciduous teeth and 32 adult teeth. So before we delve into the components of the skull and the postcranial skeleton, for that matter, what we really need to do first is to understand the anatomical planes of the body and the directionals of the body. The anatomical planes of the body, the number of them is quite simple. We live in a three-dimensional world, and so there are three anatomical planes of the body. Knowing these planes are informative because they also are the names of specific landmarks that are on the skull and other parts of the postcranial skeleton. So the three planes of the body include the sagittal, coronal, and transverse plane. The sagittal plane runs down the midline of your body. And the sagittal plane is unique in that it actually cuts you in half side to side. And it's also symmetric. You can take a piece of paper, fold it in half, cut out the outline like you may have done in nursery school or grade school, cut out half of you, unfold it, and there you have all of you. And this is a very good plane to work around because of symmetry. It also allows us to reconstruct other aspects of the body. For instance, we have a number of different fossils where we only have, or even in a forensic case, where you may only have one side of the skeleton. Now that you do, it should be very easy for you to reconstruct the other side. For instance, if you only had the right, you could reconstruct the left because they're symmetric. The coronal plane cuts you in half front to back, right? Again, it is not symmetric. The sagittal plane is the only one. And it is the difference between like the front of you and your backside. And we have terms to describe those that are much more formal we'll get into in just a moment. The transverse plane is also asymmetric, and it cuts you in half from top to bottom. When you look at all these planes of the body, the anatomical planes, they, in the front of you, meet all in one place. Does anybody know what that place is called or where it is? The place where all of the planes, the anatomical planes of the body meet, is known as your center of gravity. Your center of gravity is contained on your body, and it meets at or around your navel or your belly button. It's been actually measured by scientists, and it's not quite exactly at your belly button or navel, but that's usually a good place to estimate it. Now we move into the directionals around the body. These were created because if you think about maybe other organisms like a fish, ones that can actually move upside down, for instance, a fish will move upside down, and then, what is up, what is down, what is top, and what is bottom. We needed to create anatomists directionals around the body that were uniform, no matter what kind of component the organism is situated in three-dimensional space. And so what we've done is created a number of different directionals around the body to maintain this type of consistency. Now we have here a human skeleton and a dog skeleton, human walking a dog. Very common occurrence that you would see every day. And we have the term superior. Let's look at the human skeleton first. Superior meaning the highest, the top. Super means on top or above. And that would mean that inferior is just the opposite, which is below. You can also think of superior as closer to the skull or the cranium, and inferior closer to the tailbone, sacrum, or coccyx. Anterior and posterior may come from Latin terms and are familiar in other Romance languages like Spanish, for instance. Anterior means in front of, and posterior will mean behind. So just like anteste, for instance, anterior meaning the front of the body, in front or forward. Posterior, just like many Latin phrases like ex post facto, which means after the fact, post meaning behind or after. And so posterior means behind, or that would be kind of like your backside. If you look at these terms and on the dog, they seem very different. For instance, anterior, posterior, superior, inferior, they don't coincide with the human skeleton because if you notice, we are upright. The difference between the dog, they are completely forward, quadrupedal on all fours. Since we walk on two legs, this terminology was created specifically just for us, uniquely in that way. You'll notice that this terminology is for the most ubiquitous, that the one on the dog, for every other organism besides us. Since the terminology using anterior, posterior, superior, inferior is almost unique to humans, yes, it can be used with other animals. However, for the most part, those that study zoology or paleontology or animals that are non-human, terminology like cranial, caudal, dorsal, and ventral are used. And if you look at the way they are situated in the dog, they are the same on the human skeleton. Remember that superior, inferior, anterior, and posterior, they don't really provide, it's not really synonymous as the slide before, but these terms are. And you will see them again used more in zoology as well as the study of non-human animals. And cranial means, like it sounds, towards the cranium or the skull. Caudal is another word for the terminal vertebrae, so the caudal end towards the sacrum or coccyx. And then you have the dorsal and the ventral side. Again, these coincide with the human anatomy, right? Cranial, caudal, and then you can see ventral and dorsal. There are major components when we look at the layout of the skull, as well as the postcrania. And if you notice that your ventral side, right? The ventral side of your body is synonymous with anterior. But the ventral side of a dog is synonymous with inferior. That's why some of this terminology doesn't always fit correctly. You may see individuals that will only use cranial, caudal, dorsal, and ventral for that matter because they know it can be used across all organisms, including human and non-human animals. They are also used in human osteology. We'll talk about the ventral arc, which is on the pelvis. So you need to get some of these terms down, not only because when you are able to speak to another person in terms of human skeletal anatomy, you can be on the same page, but this terminology will also come back into play, and it will help you understand where landmarks are on certain bones. We must move into the directionals within the body. So not only do we have terminology that's universal that we can use around the body, but there is terminology that is within the body, and a lot of it has to do with the alignment along the midline or the sagittal plane. You can see the nice white line that's drawn at the midline or the sagittal plane anatomically, and of course this is a drawing by Leonardo da Vinci. Notice also this individual has their hands with their thumbs pointed laterally or to the outside, away from the midline. And that is always anatomical position, because with your thumbs pointed laterally or away from the midline, that is exposing the entire anterior view or the entire ventral side of your body, right? If you turn around and expose the posterior aspect in anatomical position, that you can then easily see the dorsal part of your arm. So the directionals within the body usually have reference to the midline. We've got, as I started mentioning, lateral, which means away from the midline, and medial is towards the midline. You can use these terms to describe something within the body as a whole, but you can also talk about it on even one bone. You can talk about the medial aspect of the ribs. That would mean the one that's closest to the sternum that articulates with it. You could talk about the lateral aspect of the rib, which is closer to the edge of the body away from the midline. You can talk about medial, lateral, or even proximal and distal, even to a landmark on bone, because that helps people figure out what you're referencing and what you're talking about. So these other terms, proximal and distal, proximal means closer to the body, and distal means further away from the body. Oftentimes, these are used with the postcranial skeleton and limb bones. And so you can talk about the most proximal aspect of the arm. That would be the area that's close to the armpit. The most distal aspect of your arm would be your fingertips. But you could use this terminology to describe the proximal end of the humerus, or the proximal end of the femur, the distal end of the tibia, so on and so forth. And we will talk about these terms when we describe some of the landmarks on bone, and they are even embedded in some of those landmarks because they're really important to use to figure out what location of the bone or the body that you're talking about.